The age of steam and smoke on the underground finally came to an end in 1905 with the electrification of the line. The choking fumes vanished, the gas lamps were replaced by bright electric bulbs, and the journey became what it is today, efficient, clean, and unremarkable. But we should not forget its birth. The London Underground was not born of quiet contemplation and elegant design. It was born of desperation and brute force. It tore the city open, poisoned its own air, and subjected its first passengers to a daily ordeal. It was built by the sweat of nameless navvies and funded by the misery of its first commuters. So the next time you step onto the tube, take a moment. Listen not just for the hum of the electric motor, but for the faint, ghostly echo of a steam whistle. Imagine the darkness, the soot, the choking smoke. The modern convenience we take for granted was forged in that subterranean hell. It was a triumph of engineering, certainly, but it was built upon a foundation of pure, unadulterated Victorian misery. By the mid-19th century, London was the titan of the world, the heart of a global empire, the hub of finance, and the most populous city on earth. It was also, quite literally, choking on its own success. The city streets, a medieval labyrinth of lanes and alleys, were hopelessly unprepared for the Industrial Revolution. Imagine the scene on Cheapside or the Strand in 1850, a street packed so tightly with horse-drawn omnibuses, private carriages, delivery carts, and a sea of pedestrians that movement slowed to a standstill. The journalist George Augustus Sala called it the Great London Block. Journeys that should have taken minutes stretched into agonizing hours. The air was thick with the stench of horse manure and coal smoke, and the noise was a deafening cacophony of iron-shod wheels on cobblestones, cracking whips, and shouting drivers. London had a terminal case of congestion. The great railway termini, Paddington, Euston, King's Cross, had brought the country closer to the capital, disgorging thousands of new arrivals every day. But they stopped at the city's edge, creating a choke point as passengers and goods had to complete their journey through the gridlock center. The problem was clear, but the solution, that was the stuff of madness. Enter Charles Pearson. A solicitor for the City of London, Pearson was a man possessed by an idea. For decades, he campaigned relentlessly for a solution that most of his contemporaries considered ludicrous: an underground railway. He envisioned a network of tunnels that would link the mainline stations and clear the streets. His colleagues thought him an eccentric bore. The press mocked him. The idea of burrowing beneath a city teeming with buildings, riddled with ancient cemeteries, and crisscrossed by a fragile network of sewers and gas pipes seemed preposterous. Where would the smoke go? Would the vibrations cause buildings to collapse? Would the tunnels not simply fill with water from the city's lost rivers? Pearson, however, was stubborn. He argued, he cajoled, and he produced endless, mind-numbingly detailed reports. And slowly, against all odds, his insane idea gained traction, not because it was elegant, but because it was necessary. In 1854, the North Metropolitan Railway Company was formed to build the world's first underground line, a modest 4-mile stretch from Paddington to Farringdon Street in the city center. But how to build it? The technology for deep-level tunneling, the kind we associate with the tube today, did not exist. The solution was as brutal as it was simple. It was called cut and cover, and it was a nightmare for everyone involved. The process was sheer brute force. First, you would demolish a line of buildings along the proposed route. Then navvies, the tough, itinerant laborers who built Britain's canals and railways, would descend with pickaxes and shovels. They dug a massive, gaping trench, sometimes 40 feet wide and 30 feet deep, straight through the heart of the city. As they dug, they had to prop up the foundations of the surrounding buildings with massive timber beams. They navigated a terrifying underworld of obstacles, Roman ruins, the bones from forgotten plague pits, and worst of all, London's primitive sewer system. The Fleet Ditch, one of London's great hidden rivers, had by then become the city's main sewer. It was a foul, stinking torrent of human and industrial waste, and the railway had to cross it. The engineers had to build a huge iron aqueduct to carry this river of filth over their new trench, while the navvies worked below in the stench. On one occasion, The sewer burst, flooding the trench with a tidal wave of raw sewage, drowning equipment, and forcing the workers to flee for their lives. For the residents and shopkeepers along the route, life became unbearable. Their streets vanished, replaced by a vast, muddy chasm. The noise was constant, the rhythmic thud of pickaxes, the grating of shovels, the shouts of foremen, and the rumble of carts hauling away thousands of tons of earth. Dust and grime coated everything. The vibrations from the digging shook buildings to their core, cracking plaster and shattering windows. Businesses were ruined, as customers could no longer reach their shops. The Illustrated London News described Euston Road as being in a state of utter chaos and confusion, a sentiment shared by anyone who had the misfortune to live or work there. This wasn't elegant engineering, it was open-heart surgery on the city, performed without anesthetic. After months of this misery, the trench would finally be deep enough. The workers would then lay the tracks at the bottom and begin constructing the tunnel itself, a huge arched vault made from millions of bricks, sealed with bitumen to keep the damp out. Once the arch was complete, they would simply fill the trench back in and rebuild the road on top, as if the gaping wound had never existed. But the scar tissue, the disruption, the bankruptcies, the years of noise and filth remained. The project was a financial black hole and a public relations disaster, but by late 1862, against all odds, it was finished. London had its underground railway. The city held its breath. Now someone had to ride it. On the 9th of January, 1863, a day before the public opening, a train full of dignitaries, investors, and politicians embarked on the inaugural journey. Prime Minister William Gladstone was there, as were the directors of the railway, their top hats and frock coats a stark contrast to the grime of the tunnels. They boarded specially prepared carriages at Paddington and plunged into the darkness. The journey was hailed as a roaring success. The newspapers declared it a triumph of British engineering, a new dawn for urban transport. The reality for the paying public, who began their journeys the next day, would be profoundly different. The grand opening was a carefully staged piece of theater. The true experience of riding the Metropolitan Railway was an assault on the senses, a journey through a subterranean inferno. The fundamental, inescapable problem was the choice of locomotive. This was the age of steam. The engines that pulled the carriages were magnificent beasts of iron and fire, but they were designed for the open air. In the enclosed space of a tunnel, they were a disaster. The designers had made some token efforts to mitigate the problem. The engines were fitted with a system that was supposed to consume its own smoke by condensing the steam in water tanks. It was a spectacular failure. As the train entered the tunnel, the world outside vanished, replaced by a thick, swirling fog. The engine belched out a toxic cocktail of steam, smoke, and sulfurous fumes. With minimal ventilation, this smog had nowhere to go. It filled the tunnel and seeped into the carriages, creating an atmosphere that was barely breathable. Passengers would later describe the air as having a physical taste, a metallic, acrid tang of coal and hot metal that coated the tongue and caught in the back of the throat. Then there was the sight, or lack thereof. The stations were lit by gas lamps, casting a dim, flickering yellow glow that barely penetrated the gloom. But the carriages themselves were dungeons on wheels. Early third-class carriages had no windows at all. Higher classes had them, but they were quickly rendered useless, coated on the outside with a thick layer of soot. Inside, a single feeble gas lamp in the ceiling fought a losing battle against the encroaching darkness. As the train chugged through the tunnels, passengers were plunged into near-total blackness, able to see only the vague outlines of the strangers packed in beside them. The noise was overwhelming. Every clank of the wheels, every hiss of the steam, every shriek of the brakes was amplified 100-fold by the brick-lined tunnels, creating a deafening, disorienting roar that made conversation impossible. And the grime, oh the grime, the soot from the engine settled on everything. A gentleman boarding at Paddington with a pristine white collar would arrive at Farringdon looking as though he had spent the day working as a coal miner. Ladies' dresses were ruined. Passengers' faces were streaked with black. They coughed and spluttered, their eyes watering from the fumes, handkerchiefs held permanently over their mouths. A letter to the Times from one early commuter complained that a journey left him with a violent headache, a feeling of nausea, and a black expectoration for the rest of the day. The company knew it had a problem. They tried to claim the sulfurous air was actually good for people, particularly those suffering from asthma. Few were convinced. The experience was so unpleasant that it quickly earned a nickname, the Drain. Riding the Metropolitan Railway wasn't a pleasant commute. It was a grim endurance test, a necessary evil undertaken only by those for whom the gridlock streets above were even worse. It was a choice between two versions of transport hell, and many chose the one that was at least mercifully quicker. The choking, sulfurous atmosphere in the tunnels was more than just an inconvenience. It was a genuine public health concern, a problem that plagued the railway for decades and led to some truly bizarre proposed solutions. The press, ever eager for a dramatic story, began to run headlines about the dangers of the sewer railway, sparking public anxiety and what became known as the dead body problem. The fear was that the noxious air, thick with what we now know to be carbon monoxide and sulfur dioxide, could be fatal. Rumors and urban legends began to spread. Stories circulated of passengers with weak hearts or delicate lungs fainting in the carriages or worse. While there is little hard evidence of passengers actually dying from asphyxiation on the trains, the fear was very real, and for the train crews, it was a daily, occupational hazard. The drivers and firemen on the footplate of the engine had it worst. They were in an open cab directly behind the smokestack, breathing in the concentrated fumes for their entire shift. It was not uncommon for a driver to feel faint at the controls, forcing his firemen to take over. On one notorious occasion, a driver and fireman were both found to have passed out as their train pulled into a station, the locomotive coming to a halt only by sheer luck. The company took to keeping a flask of brandy on the engines to revive crew members who were overcome by the fumes. It was a tacit admission that their workplace was actively trying to kill them. The railway's management scrambled for a solution. Their first idea was the most obvious: ventilation shafts. They left gaps in the tunnel roof open to the streets above, hoping the smoke would escape. This provided only marginal relief and created new problems, as rain, rubbish, and the occasional unlucky animal would fall onto the tracks. Then, things got more ambitious. In 1870, a gigantic fan, 29 feet in diameter, was installed in a shaft near Euston Square. The idea was to use it to suck the foul air out of the tunnels. When they switched it on, the effect was comical. The fan was so powerful that it created a gale-force wind inside the station. It blew passengers' hats off their heads, sent newspapers flying, and very nearly lifted women's skirts over their heads, causing a minor scandal. Worse, it didn't solve the problem. It just moved the smoke from one end of the platform to the other. The experiment was quickly abandoned. Perhaps the most outlandish proposal came from a desire to get rid of the steam engine altogether. A test line was built for a so-called pneumatic railway. The concept was wonderfully futuristic. The carriage would be a piston, propelled through a close-fitting tube by a giant fan pushing air behind it and sucking it from the front. A small prototype was built, but the engineering challenges of creating a perfect seal on such a large scale proved insurmountable. The idea was quietly dropped. For nearly 40 years, the problem of the foul air remained unsolved. The only true solution was to get rid of the steam engine itself. That would have to wait for the turn of the century and a new form of power, electricity. Until then, every journey on the underground was a gamble with one's respiratory health. The dead body problem may have been more of a media creation than a daily reality, but it stemmed from a very real and dangerous design flaw. The first underground was a system built with a fundamental contradiction at its heart. It was a triumph of civil engineering and a spectacular failure of environmental design. If the general experience of traveling on the Metropolitan Railway was hellish, that hell was not distributed equally. Victorian Britain was a society rigidly stratified by class, and this obsession with social hierarchy was built directly into the fabric of the new underground. The misery was real for everyone, but for the working class majority, it was a far deeper and darker ordeal. The railway offered 3 classes of travel, and the difference between them was stark. First class was an attempt to impose a sliver of civility onto the chaos. The carriages were slightly more spacious. The seats were upholstered, perhaps with horsehair padding, and featured armrests to delineate personal space. The gas lighting was marginally better, and the presence of windows gave the illusion of a connection to the outside world. Even if the view was just a soot-blackened tunnel wall, it was still unpleasant. but it was an experience designed to be endured by a gentleman. Second class was a significant step down. The seats were thinly padded wooden benches. It was more crowded, more functional, and offered fewer creature comforts. It was the realm of the clerk, the shopkeeper, the new middle-class commuter. But third class was something else entirely. It was transport reduced to its most basic, brutal function. The carriages were often nicknamed cattle trucks, and for good reason. They were little more than wooden boxes on wheels. There were no padded seats, just hard, unforgiving wooden benches running along the sides. In the earliest versions, there were no windows at all. When the train entered a tunnel, the passengers were plunged into absolute claustrophobic darkness, the only light coming from the cracks around the doors. These carriages were deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. They were packed to bursting, far beyond their intended capacity, with passengers standing crushed together in the gloom. The air, already foul throughout the train, was at its thickest and most stagnant here. It was a space of shared misery, where exhausted laborers, factory workers, and domestic servants stood shoulder to shoulder, swaying in the darkness, breathing in the poison. Yet, here lies the great paradox of the early underground. For all its misery, it was a powerful force for social change. The company was legally obligated to run workmen's trains early in the morning and late at night, offering tickets at a fraction of the normal price. The workman's penny fare allowed, for the first time, a laborer to live in a slightly more distant, slightly cheaper suburb and commute into the city for work. It gave the working classes a mobility they had never known. This was the devil's bargain. The system offered a chance at a marginally better life, but the price was a daily journey through the underworld. Imagine a navvy, after a 12-hour day of back-breaking physical labor, his body aching with fatigue. His reward was not rest, but 30 minutes crammed into a dark, airless swaying box, choking on smoke before he could finally reach home. It was a form of freedom, but it was a freedom that came with a daily dose of suffering. This was the true face of progress in Victorian London, a revolutionary concept delivered through a deeply miserable experience.